Welcome to Saltwater Aquarium Radio, the podcast that brings you saltwater aquarium information, tips, and stories to help you become more successful with your own salty venture. Now here's your host, Jeff Hesketh.
What's going on, guys? Jeff here for the Saltwater Aquarium Radio podcast, episode number 38. And today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking with a lady by the name of Felicia. Felicia has had a number of interesting jobs in this industry and has a lot of insight. And we're going to talk about her passion when it comes to this hobby, micro reefs. So let's kick the tires and light the fires. What's going on, guys? Jeff here, episode number 38. And before we jump into our interview with Felicia, we have another 5-star review that I wanted to share with you here on the podcast. And it's titled Fresh to Salt. It's by R. Mullis. I hope I'm getting that right. I work on the road. I have been into freshwater for a while, and I needed something to learn about salt because your podcast nailed what I needed. Keep up the great work. R. Mullis, you are awesome. Thank you for leaving a 5-star review for us on iTunes, and thank you for your support here on the Saltwater Aquarium Radio podcast. For everybody else out there that feels that this podcast deserves a 5-star review, you can do that whatever platform that you're listening to this podcast on, and I read each and every one of them, and every once in a while, like to read them here on the podcast. So if you have a minute, leave a review because it helps out the podcast. It helps get it out in front of new people who potentially could learn something and benefit from the stuff that we're talking about here on the Saltwater Aquarium Radio podcast. Thank you. So a little bit of a backdrop to today's episode. I am an avid Coral magazine reader, and I recently purchased the app for my iPad where you have the ability to actually check out old issues of the magazine. And I found this one. I don't know why I was drawn to it at first, but I eventually figured out why my eye was drawn to it, and I talked about it with Felicia. It is the first time that a human had ever been on the cover of Coral magazine, and it was Felicia's child. And in that issue, I found an article written by Felicia, liked it so much, and I actually reached out to her to see if she wanted to be on the podcast, and she said yes. And that's what we're going to do in today's episode of the podcast. We're going to talk to Felicia about micro reefs. That was what her article was about in Coral magazine, and she has some of the most absolutely beautiful micro reefs that I've ever seen. So let's jump in our interview with Felicia about micro reefs. Felicia, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
I've been in the aquarium industry for most of my adult life. Started out at Petsmart in Pittsburgh in the early 2000s. And then I worked at Doctors Foster and Smith in their live Aquaria department. In 2006, I think I started there. And then I was the Diver's Den photographer and the person who, identified all the corals and critters and put them up on the website after photographing them. And I loved that job. It was like Christmas every day, I say. Then after that, I worked for a few different aquarium stores. I was a manager at a store and did some aquarium maintenance. I've worked in the wholesale side, and right now I'm working for an online retailer called Marine Depot, and I've been writing for Coral Magazine for about 8 years or so. I have 2 little boys at home. One is 5 and one is 9 months old, and I have a 16-year-old parrot, a lot of fish. I have a couple of fish tanks, I think 8 now. I have a gem tang that I won from a raffle a couple years ago that I love, and a bearded dragon, and that's my life pretty much.
So as far as the reef tank, because I guess you work in the industry, but the hobby side of it, when did you get started in the hobby side of reef tanks?
I had a tank when I was a little kid, so I don't really like to count that. But it was around the late 90s, early 2000s that I really started getting into aquariums in general. So when I was working at PetSmart, I'd say is when I started getting into marine tanks. I had a friend there named Luke who had lionfish at home, and that's what got me interested originally.
And as far as the working in the industry, when When did that start? Or how did you come into that?
Well, I started working at Petsmart in the early, I can't even remember what year at this point, maybe 2001, 2002-ish. And I worked there for a long time. And then in 2006, I started working at Doctors Foster and Smith. I just happened to move to Wisconsin, right near the town where Doctors Foster and Smith was located. And, I started talking to some local people, and they said, hey, you should definitely work at Doctors Foster and Smith. And I said, oh, okay, cool. I'll put my application in, and I got hired, and then that was it. That was the real start to working in this industry, and I'm sure I'll never do anything else.
You've already kind of touched on this next question, but was it fish or corals that got you into saltwater aquariums?
Probably both. My interests have changed over the years. Sometimes I'll be really into fish at the moment, and I'll be really wanting to breed some new cool fish. And then I'll get tired of fish for a while, and I'll want to move to, collecting and growing different kinds of corals, and then it's invertebrates. It's always kind of changing.
So what did your first reef tank look like?
Crap. Doesn't everyone's?
Actually, mine was really good. My first one.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself, but your article in Coral Magazine, it was your typical 55-gallon aquarium. That was strongly recommended to beginners. That's what I started with. Oh,
exactly. You had to start with a 55 back then.
It was the only way.
Anything smaller was too small and you would fail. Well, I just got rid of my Excalibur skimmer. I don't know if you remember those.
I remember the name.
Everybody made fun of me about it because I don't know why I still had it. I had it in my fish room. I just have, kind of a pile of stuff, and I was looking for a new pump for it, and I got a lot of jeering for that. It was not a nice tank, I'll say that. It was pretty typical, what's this, an Aptasia? I had no idea what I was doing.
What did that first tank teach you?
Patience, maybe?
I usually like to ask that question because my first tank being the 55-gallon, there wasn't anything I could do wrong to that system. I didn't dip corals. I didn't quarantine fish. I just threw everything in the tank and everything worked. And I never had any pests. I didn't have any diseases. That first tank taught me absolutely nothing. And that's usually why I ask that question, because it wasn't until my second tank, my upgrade, where I started learning some of my faults as a hobbyist.
I think my biggest fault as a hobbyist is just I don't have time and energy usually to do what I'd really, really like to do with my home tanks. So they tend to be a little embarrassing in real life, but it's a work in progress. My work tanks were always perfect and stunning, but home tanks, they're always total garbage.
Did you find that your home tanks turn into more experiments than actual display tanks?
Yes. My home tanks generally have a single purpose, and it's usually not display. My home tanks are for example, I had this 75-gallon that was a seahorse grow out, and it had more algae in it than probably all of the ocean combined. But there were also, 100 adult seahorses in a 75-gallon tank. So of course it's going to be hideous. But, the goal wasn't to look great. The goal was to house seahorses.
So I have the Coral Magazine app on my iPad. I was looking through old issues of the magazine, and I stumbled across the January, February issue for 2018, and I found an article titled Bowling for Corals, which was an article written by you. When did you start keeping these small micro reefs?
This particular one, I started, I want to say 2015. I had a 6-gallon cube at home. And I had a little baby, so I wasn't really doing a whole lot with aquariums at the time. So I just thought this would be something really simple to do, something interesting for my kid to look at. And I had a friend who gave me a bunch of corals when I lived in Connecticut. And then I moved to Pennsylvania when my son was 6 months old. And I dropped those corals off at my other friend's house, and he held on to them for me until I was ready. So those are the corals that ended up being transferred into the the little 6-gallon cube I had here in Pennsylvania in 2015. So I'd actually had these corals for, several years, but I was just kind of starting out with new fragments from the old colonies that I had, which was kind of neat. And my mom found this vase that's in the article at an antique shop, and she sent me a picture of it and said, "Do you want this for anything?" And I said, "Yes." So she bought it for me, brought it home, and I think it was October 2016, maybe a little bit before that. I have the earliest picture I have of it is from October 2016 of my little sad coral mixture in this little pico. The 6-gallon cube was not very clean. I had a clingfish in there that you could kind of pet and feed by hand, and my son loved it, but it wasn't very conducive to coral keeping. So when I got the new vase, the 2-gallon vase, and I moved all the coral into there, they really started doing a lot better because I was able to keep it a little cleaner and keep up with the maintenance. So the clingfish stayed in the 6-gallon, and the coral moved to the pico and started doing amazing.
Backtracking to your move from Connecticut, because I've recently have been down in Connecticut, and it seems to be a very strong presence from a saltwater or reef tank community vibe there. How is that out in Pennsylvania?
Honestly, Pennsylvania is a big state. So Philadelphia, I used to live in Philadelphia in 2011 to 2013, I think, and the reef community in Philadelphia is thriving. It's big. Pittsburgh, less so, and I'm kind of in the middle between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and there's almost nothing here. I know one other guy named Rick. He's been my best friend for like 20 years. He's a major reef keeper, and we live in the same town, and we're about it.
I know that's kind of off topic, but I just, because I've spent some time in Pennsylvania, and I don't remember seeing any reef stores or anything like that. So I was wondering what that was like out there.
We have a little one here in town. They're called Saltwater Shack. And my friend Rick has he does tank maintenance, and he goes around fixing tanks. He's Ricky Finn's Aquatics. So we have a little bit here, but it's nothing like what it was like in Connecticut. There's a lot going on in Connecticut. I was at House of Fins in Greenwich there, and that place is like heaven of local fish stores. Actually,
the last show I went to was the Keep On Reefing Expo in Connecticut, and I was pretty blown away by how many people showed up.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovative breeding going on up there too. Colchester Pet.
As far as the micro size reefs, that obviously you were talking a small container, what is necessary for equipment to have a successful micro reef tank?
That's the beauty of it. I just had really simple. I had a tiny little power head, a little betta heater, and a really inexpensive light from a brand called ABI. It's like a 14K 38 par lamp that you can just screw into like a reptile lamp. Really, really simple stuff. I know people who keep these micro reefs with just an air pump and, light air pump, tiny heater. That's it. What do you really need for a reef? What more do you need? Light, flow, temperature regulation.
As far as the aquascape of a micro reef, are you using sand, live rock?
I personally didn't use sand, but I don't really use sand in most of my tanks. It's just easier for me to keep them clean. But my friend Mary from the same issue of Coral Magazine that had my article about pico reefs, she had an article in there too about hers. They call it the Maritza bowl. I believe that's how she pronounces it. And but they definitely use sand in theirs. I've seen other people use sand in their picos. It's it's like an aesthetics thing.
From a maintenance standpoint, it's probably beneficial to not have the sand in there. From a cleaning it out and making sure that there's no detritus.
I guess everybody has an opinion on that, and I just think bare bottom tanks are easier.
So as far as livestock in a miniature reef tank, what can you get away with for obviously corals? I mean, you can continue to chop them down. But as far as fish and invertebrates, what works well in a micro reef?
I haven't tried any fish in this micro reef because I have other tanks, so I don't really have a reason to, but you could probably get away with, something like trimagobies or little gobiodon gobies. What are they called? Clown gobies. Really, really tiny things that don't grow at all. Some of the invertebrates I've had, I had an urchin. One of my son's first words, he was about a year old, and he said urchin. We were at the pet shop, and he said urchin. It was from one of his books, one of his little children's books. So I immediately had to buy that urchin for him.
That's awesome.
And we had it for a long time. So that was a blue tuxedo urchin. Let me think here. I had coral banded shrimp. That did really well. Hermit crabs, of course. You can get some fancy, like blue knuckle hermit crabs, Halloween hermit crabs always do well. Sexy shrimp. As long as you can keep things pretty stable, do your regular water changes, maintenance, there's really not much limit on invertebrates, little crustaceans that you can keep. Squat lobsters are great for pico reefs. Peppermint shrimp.
I'd imagine location plays a pretty important role in keeping a successful micro reef. You wouldn't want it exposed to direct sunlight, maybe next to a door that opens up often, letting in heat or cold air. I'd imagine those things play a pretty substantial role in maintaining a stable marine environment.
I was concerned about it because it's such a small volume of water that any kind of temperature fluctuation could harm it. So I definitely try to keep mine in a stable spot in my house.
As far as maintenance for your micro reef, what does that look like?
I do a lot of very big water changes. I know some hobbyists are not comfortable doing big water changes, but I'm really used to matching parameters and temperatures, from broodstock tanks having to always do very, very large water changes. So it's just my style. You don't have to, but I'm used to doing, at least 50% water changes on this bowl every couple weeks. I try to do it more often.
As far as coral growth, how fast are your corals growing?
Sometimes too fast. Sometimes I have to cut them.
That's a good problem to have.
Yeah, I've moved a lot out of the bowl because I just didn't want to cut them anymore because they came out so, they were doing so well and I loved the growth. So I would move them into other tanks. So a pico reef is kind of nice. If you have a lot of other tanks, you can just swap things around. I still have most of the original corals that went into the antique vase. Of course, my favorite one is the one that died, but that red Monty, I've had to chop that up a few times, but the center of it grows on the rock and then it just plates outward. So it's really easy to just get in there with the bone cutters and snip off the plates and give them away. That's
an interesting choice for a micro reef to have a Monty Pork cap in there because that's pretty fast growing coral, isn't it?
I just snip off the plates that grow outward. They're very easy to just cut. My parents have a tank. I have friends who have tanks. I'm just always like, hey, who wants red Monty? Move them to other tanks. I'm a little worried right now about this Cyphastria that I have, though. It's a Superman Cyphastria, and I tried to put it on a little island, but recently its growth has just exploded, and I'm watching it very closely. I'm like, don't you dare move off that rock.
When you're selecting corals for a micro reef, is that something that you take into consideration, like as far as the lighting situation that you have within the tank?
At this point, I have an AI Prime, and my bowl got an upgrade last year to it's like an 8-gallon sphere now, which is pretty neat looking. And so I'm not limited at all by what corals I can keep. And I've always had acros in it too. I have a few in there right now that are really thriving.
Because I have a hard time keeping acros in a 220-gallon.
I mean, I've had some die, but I have some that are pretty old in there. One is one of the originals from Connecticut. It was a clipping from my friend Ryan. It's some kind of deep water bottle brush, Acropora. I treasure it. Thank you, Ryan.
So what are the benefits and drawbacks to a micro reef?
Well, the drawbacks I'll go over first because they can be devastating. I thought, hey, this is awesome. I've been doing this thing for a couple years and everything's going awesome and I'm not having any trouble at all. just, keeping up with it. And so I was due to have baby number 2 in November, and I went into labor in October. So he was about 6 weeks early, and I had about 3 weeks in the hospital that was an hour away from my house. And I wasn't allowed to leave the hospital before I had him. So I was just kind of trapped there. And, my tanks were all at home with, people taking care of them who weren't, 100% sure what they were doing, people who couldn't come over every day. So when I got home with the new baby, my Pico Reef was the thing that suffered the most. I said, oh my God, half my corals are dead. And, my family looked and said, oh, which ones are the dead ones? So, it's not anybody's fault. It just kind of happened and we weren't prepared. None of us were really prepared. So you have to have some stability in your life, I guess, to really be successful with them. But it's bouncing back. That red Monty that's been in the bowl this whole time, forever, for years, it was literally stark white. It was completely white, pale. And my friends had said, hey, you should pull that out of there. That's dead. I said, no, just let me, I'm just going to see if it comes back. It took more than 6 months for it to finally get its color back. Every day I would study it and I'd say, okay, it still has flesh. I'm just going to let it go. And what I would do is I clipped a craft mesh, a piece of clear craft mesh. And I used a plastic clip to shade the Monty because it's so close to the light. And religiously did my water changes, fed the tank really well. And it took 6 months, but that thing finally regained its color and it's looking pretty good today.
So did you slowly, because you shaded the coral, did you have to slowly work that off from the Monty Port cap to kind of get the colors to come back?
Well, when it finally started coloring up again, it was kind of, instead of the nice red that it used to be, it was kind of brown. And what's interesting, what came back first were the little polyps. I noticed there were some really bright red polyps coming out through the white tissue, and then slowly, months and months and months more would come. It started out with just 3 and then 10 and then the whole thing and then more color. And eventually I just started taking the mesh off for more and more time over, during the day. So I really babied it.
What are the benefits of a micro reef?
They're pretty easy to keep, I think. Inexpensive. If you want to start a reef tank and you don't have thousands and thousands of dollars laying around, you can spend a few $100s on something really tiny, some tiny coral. You don't have to get the more difficult SPS corals. I have a lot of zoas in this tank, a lot of zoanthids that do great. And you can find some, nice inexpensive ones that are easier to keep. So that's probably the biggest benefit, is really, really low equipment cost, and just do water changes often. And you can't really mess up doing that. Do
you find that with the advances in the hobby that it's easier for somebody new coming into the hobby to be successful with a micro reef?
I think the knowledge that we have, the collective knowledge that we have in the reef community today, that's definitely why we can do this now. Like you said earlier about, back in the day, we were all told you can't have anything smaller than a 55-gallon or you'll fail. You have to keep everything stable. And, now we have the ability to do that. We have, we understand more about chemistry now, and we have the ability to test it.
I just had a random thought while you were saying that. Do you do any type of redundancy in your tank to, safeguard it from heater failure or anything like that?
I should, especially because right before I had baby number 2, I went away for a weekend to do an aquarium talk out in Philadelphia. And when I came home, I realized that I had accidentally bumped my heater and it was up to 84 degrees. And so my corals were already looking kind of sad. And then soon after that, that's when I went into labor, and everything, I think they didn't have time to really recover well from that heater incident. And then it just crashed.
You wrote an article about Monty Port as well for Coral magazine too, haven't you?
I did. That was probably my favorite article that I've ever written for them, mainly because of the conversation I had with Sally Jo Headley.
Sally Jo.
Oh my goodness. You remember Garf?
Yes, I do. That website I devoured.
Yes.
When I first got into the hobby.
Absolutely. Like in the late 90s, Garf was where you went for your information. But that woman is not just a pioneer in our industry / hobby. She is a poet. She has a way with words. And when she was talking about Monopora, I could just feel the love and the passion that she has for these animals, this hobby. And she was talking about Leroy, who her husband that she, started Garf with. And he recently passed away years ago. And just hearing her talk about the coral and how she and Leroy interacted with the coral and just the stories that she was telling brought tears to my eyes. She's amazing. So I really loved working on that article. Thank you, Sally.
Felicia, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Where can people find out more about you?
I'm on Facebook. If anybody wants to ask me any questions, I usually answer them. Or you can check out the latest issue of Coral Magazine anytime. I usually have something in there. I do some writing for reefs.com also. If you want to see more pictures of my Pico Reef, my reef bowl, I'm on Instagram, Reef_Felicia, Felicia.
Awesome, Felicia. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, so I hope you enjoyed that interview with Felicia. And Felicia has a couple of different socials, and I'm going to be plugging those in the show notes if you'd like to follow her. And she never mentioned it actually during the podcast, but she has a YouTube channel that seems to be kind of left behind. But there's some interesting content over there as well, and I'll be sure to include that in the show notes. So if you want to check out everything that we talked about in today's episode, jump over to saltwateraquariumradio.com/SAR038. That's saltwateraquariumradio.com/SAR038. We've reached that point in the podcast where we answer the question of the week now. We have added a new feature to the question of the week, and I'm very, very excited about it. You now have the ability to leave a voice message for me, and next week we're going to actually start using you guys who leave a message on this program in the podcast so we can answer your question. I think it's going to add a really interesting dynamic to the question of the week, and I'm really excited about it. So if you want to leave a question to be answered here on the podcast, jump over to the show notes at saltwateraquariumradio.com, or you can click on the podcast Q&A link that is in the show notes. That also will bring you to that page where you can click on that, and all you need is a mic. I think you can use your phone and leave a message, and hopefully we can answer your question right here on the podcast. This week's question of the week is brought to you by Mystery Reef Box. Mystery Reef Box is my company, and it is a subscription box that is delivered to your door each and every month. There's no long-term commitment. You can cancel anytime, and there's tons of useful items that come to you every single month. We have two different boxes. We have the original box, which is $45 a month, and we also have the Nano box, which is $29.99 a month. And the best thing about Mr. Reef Box is for every box that we sell, we donate $1 to the AID project, which is Walt Smith's project down in Fiji, and does a number of different things for restoring the natural reefs of Fiji. And if the box wasn't enough, we also do a contest where if you do an unboxing on YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook and put the hashtag Mystery Reef Box unboxing in the title, you are automatically entered into the monthly contest where we give away additional aquarium equipment. This month we have the Hanna calcium checker, which is going to be up for grabs. So all you need to do is get yourself a box, sign up at MrReefBox.com, and do your unboxing, share it on YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram, and you may be in the running for a brand new Hanna Instruments calcium checker. This week's question of the week comes from Jill, and Jill says, Jeff, thank you for the podcast and your content that you create on Mad Hatter's Reef. I enjoy everything that you do, and it's extremely helpful. My question for you is, what do you think is better, wild-caught fish or aquacultured fish? Thank you for everything that you do, and I look forward to hearing your response to this question on the podcast. Jill, thank you so much for asking this question. I'm going to do my best to answer it. I'm going to start off with aquacultured fish because I think that that's probably the best place to start. To have the ability to captive breed certain species of marine fish is incredibly important to the long-term sustainability of this hobby. But every single captive bred fish started with wild collection. And if you don't have the ability to collect wild fish, you may not have the ability in the future to breed them in captivity. So Jill, to answer your question, I think it's both extremely important to see the value in both wild caught and aquaculture, because without one or the other, the future of this hobby is probably not as bright. So during my interview with Felicia, I asked her this question because she has a lot of background in aquaculture and has done a lot of work to support it, and I was very interested in what she had to say about it. And if you want to hear Felicia's response, you can jump over to the website, saltwateraquariumradio.com, and just below the logo on your mobile device, it says support us on Patreon. You click on that. I'll bring you over to Patreon where you can sign up and get access to all sorts of behind the podcast type stuff over there. So little interesting way to support the podcast and help us out here at saltwateraquariumradio.com. All right, folks, that's going to be a wrap on this episode of the Saltwater Aquarium Radio Podcast. If you want to check out the stuff that we talked about in today's episode, in the show notes, there's tons of links there. There's also more content over at saltwateraquariumradio.com/SAR038. That is saltwateraquariumradio.com/SAR038. That's it for today. I'll see you next time right here with a brand new episode.
You've been listening to the SAR Podcast. To find out more about today's topics featured on the show, as well as more episodes of the SAR Podcast, visit www.saltwateraquariumradio.com.